Hi, and welcome to episode 24 of the ChessTDD series. It's been a little while, and my apologies for that. I took some time over the holidays and wasn't in the IDE a whole ton, at least not for the purposes of recreational coding, so to speak. But I'm back now, and to get back in the swing of things, I decided to take a crack at refactoring some of the stuff that I had set aside last time when doing the acceptance tests. Rather than kind of reminding myself how everything with SpecFlow worked, I figured I'd ease back into it this way. Get the house in order, so to speak, so that as I went in and wrote more acceptance tests, they would be easier to do and I wouldn't be expanding any kind of mess that I had. Excuse me, and I've been a little bit under the weather here, so pardon my voice and any throat clearing that you might hear. First up, what I decided to do is add a class around this method and then make it an instance method. The thing that I'm kind of trying to do here, and that gets interesting, is refactoring test code to go into production. This isn't something I do a whole lot. My natural inclination here is to, rather than think about getting tests read specifically, to keep the whole thing green because it is a refactoring. It's just kind of a moving of things around. Certainly open to better suggestions that might be out there. I don't know if this is the greatest way to do it, but it's effective, and I've had luck with it in the past. As long as you stay green and you kind of try not to get too far out of band as you go with failures, I think it's kind of hard to go wrong. I'm not really adding any new functionality here. So you can see that things aren't compiling. The reason for that is I sort of dove right into the heart of the matter here and grabbed this most commonly referred to method. So what I need to do is go and find all the places that aren't compiling and then add a reference to this class. But before I did that, as I was writing this code a little bit earlier, I decided instead of kind of messing around this much incrementally, I'd just create a new class, standalone class here inside of the test code base and get it working that way rather than mess around with inner class or nested classes. So I will get this working here, and then I'll probably fairly quickly take the step to move this thing into the actual production code base. The reason I don't just kind of do it all in one fell swoop is, like I'd said, I want to get as many checkpoints with green tests as possible. So right now, the thing I'm proving out here is changing the functionality from this static setup in one of the test classes to my new instance class here. That's a thing that can go wrong. Moving the functionality over to production, as little different as that is, that's another thing that can go wrong. And during a refactoring, now I see my green tests, so at least some of these are passing. I don't think I have a clean build yet, but NCrunch is clever enough, I believe, to run some of these. I'm not sure. It's been a while since I looked into this, but I do get that dark green, even though it doesn't look like everything's compiling. And I've been in the Java world for a while where apparently it's normal to be able to run tests in Eclipse, even if your code isn't compiling everywhere. Anyway, the philosophy here in general for me is that I want to stay as close to green as possible. And not just that, but I want to vary as few things at once as possible. So if I'm going to do a refactoring, I'd get myself there maybe incrementally, make sure I'm green. Then I pick out the next thing incrementally that I want to vary, and keep going that way. So having said that, I have now moved things over from the test code. I've moved my new class over from the test code to the production code. At which point now I had stuff in this acceptance test that was no longer passing. Actually, I think probably what was going on is this was never passing, but NCrunch was smart enough to run the chess.test project anyway, so I was seeing green tests over there, even though the acceptance tests were not compiling or passing. That's an oversight on my part that sort of runs counter to what I was telling you, but I guess do as I say, not as I accidentally did, so to speak. That's not great. I probably should have been a bit more thorough, but spoiler alert, the tests all wind up green anyway. Interesting kind of lesson there is that you might not, well, it's the same lesson I've sort of touched on throughout doing this series, which is you're going to make mistakes no matter how long you've been doing this, or you're going to do things that are less than ideal. You just kind of scratch your head, try to learn from it, and move on. So what I'm doing now is just, more extension of this same refactoring. The general vision here is that I want to create a kind of a canonical board builder type of class. I think I called it piece. I don't even remember. I guess, piece positioner. There it is. Sorry, I have the setup of the mic is partially in the way of the screen. Piece positioner, the idea is to create kind of a standard thing here where I'm going to pass this a board and then say piece positioner is going to have methods like, set up a standard chessboard or set up player 1 only or player 2 only or whatever. So that's kind of where I'm trying to go with this, and then go back through and clean all the cruft out of the test setup methods so that they're all using that one virtuous input. And the reason that I figured that that would be a good thing to do, I don't know if this is like the perfect implementation by any stretch, but it sort of seems like given how many different testing contexts I want certain kinds of setups in, that maybe it makes sense to make piece positioning a first class implementation of the actual chess game. So if I were providing this to consumers as an API, it seems like a nice piece of functionality to provide. I don't view it as gold plating because I have proven that there's use for it in my test setup. It's a popular philosophy that your unit tests are the first exercising of your API, or you are your own first customer. So what I'm doing now that you're probably watching and perhaps wondering about is that I'm making piece positioner taking its constructor aboard. It just seems like, given some of the repeat operations that I'm doing on it, instead of saying set up the standard pieces for this board and then the parameters, it seems likely to me that piece positioner is probably only going to act on a single board, at least in the way that I'm using it. It may be that we want to change that later, but we can worry about that later, I suppose, if there is a case where you want to have a single piece positioner setting up a bunch of different boards. So far, I haven't conceived of any scenario in this application yet where you would have multiple boards. Maybe it was like modeling one of those deals in the park where a guy is playing like 20 games of chess or something. But we can cross that bridge when we come to it. As is, it feels like a reasonable enough implementation to pass in the board to the piece positioner and then have the positioner do things to that board. And another thing is, probably at some point later, I will add some unit tests for this piece of code that had been in a test class and is now in production. So this thing, the piece positioner, is covered, but it's covered by test setup. And that's sort of a bit of an oddity. It'd be nice to have some first-class tests on there. But we can feel relatively good about it because your unit tests and your production code are sort of like double-entry bookkeeping. I think I first heard that reference from Uncle Bob somewhere, but they're a series of checks and balances for one another. So taking something that was setting up another class and then executing some tests on it so it was part of your setup, then you take that setup and move it into production. In a way, the tests of that other class are still validating this, because if something were suddenly wrong with the setup, you would imagine that things would go wrong with those tests. Now, that's not perfect. It's sort of a coincidental validation. That's why we'd like to get some test coverage around this stuff that used to be part of the test setup and is now part of production. But it's also not the same as having no coverage. So at some point later, I'll probably want to come back and drive out some functionality of this thing as a first class production piece of code. Then reasoning about things like, are the methods that you invoke on the position are generally going to be cumulative, or would one obliterate the other, and how is that managed? So in this case, I'm setting things up on different rows of the chessboard, but what if I were to invoke these calls on the same row? Would that throw an exception? Would it overwrite the previous thing? So there are things that we can think about there in future treatments of the positioner class. But for right now, I'm just kind of doing a refactoring so that these tests are generally not nearly as ugly in terms of setup, and especially where one of the test classes is calling into the other one. And the way to accomplish that was by consolidating all this useful functionality, and then it's not that big a leap to say, hey, we've got a lot of useful functionality that we're invoking over and over again. Why don't we put that into the production code and let our consumers use it as well? So again, this is this pretty similar stuff. This is kind of blocking and tackling type refactoring. Just moved another method into our positioner class, and now I'm going in and doing the same reasoning about the parameters and passing the board in as a field rather than, or I should say as a constructor argument rather than passing it in over and over again to each method. Now, I kind of took a look at this and said, probably the next thing I want to do here is I'm calling the same sort of thing a few times. I'm going to set up the pawns on each side of the board, and then the standard pieces I'm calling it on each side of the board. So I'm actually now going to stub out a method here called setup standard board. And now, even though I'm doing it from setup, I'm kind of going back to, because now I've got sort of, now that the refactoring is done, I actually have first class production code. So this is a little weird. I'm going red from the setup of a class, but it still conforms to the TDD paradigm. I'm creating a red test, and then now I'm making it go green by declaring and implementing this method. So this is really what I wanted to get to. Now I've set up a standard board. Rather than kind of calling these things row by row in each test setup, there are a number of places in the test setup where I just want to say, hey, give me a chessboard. And that's what I've got now. What I'm doing going into that class is I'm going to make a note here on the Trello board to say, it looks like I made an oversight where I was setting up the white and the black pieces. For whatever reason, I didn't set up the black pawns to be player 2. So that should probably be done somewhere. And that actually might make a great first TDD drive at this new piece positioner class. So I can say, hey, there's something wrong here. Maybe that second to last row should be the same player as the last row. We're pretty sure that that's true, so I can write a test that fails there, maybe in the next episode, and make that pass to correct that mistake. Your mileage may vary there a little. I am often inclined to let small errors like that go and put them on a to-do list for a little bit later if they're not breaking anything that I have here critically. So I've got a whole bunch of passing tests and good functionality. I haven't yet driven out something that's going to fail if I don't set that piece allegiance or whatever you want to call it correctly. That's just stuff that I have to do later. I'm not going to break my train of thought and scramble to fix that right now. There's clearly functionality missing, and that will get addressed. So what I'm doing now is I'm kind of moving back here methodically and going to the same semantics across the board for using this new positioner. So where I had gotten it to compile by using this instantiation on each line, I want to go back and be consistent. Then it would help if I passed in the constructor argument. And there the dots go green again, so we're good. So I'm just kind of opening up each of these classes in turn and making sure that I like the way the setup looks. Making sure I'm not invoking more setup somewhere in these methods. So now the test setup for these classes is starting to get a lot less nasty. This one has only the one-liner here, so I think I leave it. If I were going to do more setup later, I'd declare a local for the positioner, but I'm not. So I'm just going to move on. And here it looks like, again, the same thing with just the one-liner for instantiation. So it looks pretty good. And I feel good about being able to move that card across on the Trello board to say, hey, we got rid of the board population problem that was sort of burgeoning in the test classes with all the classes kind of calling into one another in ugly fashion. I am going to add a card to say, let's add some first class tests for the piece positioner. And probably when I do that, I should remind myself to, add in a bug fix to get the functionality going there. Excuse me. So the next thing I did before wrapping up in this episode is I said, okay, that's great. We, especially for the acceptance tests, this looks a lot better to me. Positioner.setup standard board. It's a nice one-liner instead of whatever I was doing in here before, calling that test class, or I don't remember what exactly. This looks better. What doesn't look good to me is this kind of ugly casting. So what I had done a little bit before this episode was kind of read through a couple of blog posts on SpecFlow. Didn't do a whole ton of prep, so what you're seeing me do is kind of reminding myself what this API looks like for this SpecFlow context thing. And what I had remembered from my reading was that there were generic get and set for context. I don't know a great deal about how they work, but so this was kind of an experiment that worked. So had it not worked, you would have seen me do a good bit of floundering and probably run over on time here. But the scenario context current is sort of a singleton-y instance of that. It looks like scenario context current is a static scenario context, but it's an instance. So scenario context current dot get and set. These are generic methods that let you drop things into the context in a strongly typed fashion. So I gave that a try and all the tests stayed green. So this is behaving as I thought. I'm not entirely sure how it indexes these things using this getter and setter. I suspect that it might be indexing them on the type. So I might get, if I don't specify a key, I might get one and only one board instance if I were to put something else in there in the set for board. I'm guessing it would probably, maybe it does something like get the fully qualified type name as a string and use that to index. All speculative, probably something I'll discover later if I get more exotic here, but this is starting to look a lot nicer to me using this generic. Now I'm not doing that kind of ugly looking casting. I've got nice strongly typed methods. So given a normal chessboard and a declare a board, I use the positioner to set up the board, and then I put that board into the test context. And then when I look for moves available for a pawn, I grab the board out of the context, look for the set of moves from that particular coordinate, and then I put those moves into the context. And then down here, finally, what I'm going to do is say, let's get the moves out of the const and assert that there is a move in there that results in 1-3. Everything's great. So I'm pleased with that. I did a little bit of poking at this, and I think you'll see me briefly go in here and change board coordinate for 1,2 to something like 3,2. I tend to get a little antsy when I'm kind of doing things where I don't really fully understand what I'm doing. I'm sort of experimenting with the API and everything's staying green. I've been burned at times in the past by, oh, you know what? I'm going to do a bit of refactoring here, but I'll finish the thought. I've been burned at times in the past by everything staying green for a really long time where I didn't really know fully what I was doing. And hey, this is great and wonderful. Turned out, I had done something trivial a la, putting an assert true in or something. I mean, not literally that, but that kind of thing where I was incorrectly green for extended periods of time. Similar earlier actually to me being mistaken that it wasn't running all test projects before, so I was green there. So the lesson is when you're green for a long time, make sure you can go red easily. So anyway, that being said, what I'm doing here is just pulling out, for readability's sake, a couple of little auxiliary methods in this class instead of scenario context .current .whatever. I kind of like to fall on the grenade of nastiness like that. I put it into these two helper methods, and quite probably those will wind up going somewhere as shorthand to be used across all of these acceptance tests, but I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. We don't have any additional acceptance test classes just yet to do something like that, so I'm going to settle for the readability of just pulling it out to a internal method there. And to me, this is more readable anyway. I imagine that's probably true across the board, but I'm going to say, all right, get from context and set in context. There might be better names I could come up with there, but I'm a big believer in not getting too caught up in making everything perfect. As long as what I do is an improvement over what was there, I feel good about what I'm doing. I can always make more improvements later. See there, I briefly tried to see if I could infer the type in that getter, which was clearly stupid. It's just an indication that I've been in Java land for too long. My C#'s getting a little rusty. And this is it. So I've got green here. I was playing around with a little, kind of moving things around to see about readability, settled back on that 3-liner and decided to call it a day. So going to make the Trello cards copacetic. I did run a little long, so I'm not showing you my commit to GitHub in the video. I will go do that right now as I produce the video. And I'll see you next time when maybe we get back to doing some actual acceptance tests. Have a good one.